The sky over Zalera split open with fire. A wounded starship plummeted through the heavens, leaving a trail of burning wreckage as it spiraled toward the emerald expanse of the jungle below. From the tallest spire of the high sanctum, Lady Zalera watched in silence, her sharp, violet gaze fixed on the descent. An outsider had come. Her grip tightened on the balcony railing. Zalera, the hidden world of her people, had remained untouched for centuries. No male had ever set foot on their sacred land. The last recorded encounter with an outsider had been generations ago, and it had ended in blood. The elders had warned that males, especially human males, were dangerous, disruptive, and impossible to control. So why did she feel something other than dread? She inhaled deeply, pushing aside the unease stirring in her chest. Duty came first. With a swift turn, her dark cloak billowing behind her, Zalera strode down the polished marble corridors of the sanctum. The guards, tall, imposing women in shimmering combat armor, fell into step beside her without a word. The High Council would demand answers, and as Zalera's youngest sentinel, she was expected to act. She would find this outsider. And if he proved to be a threat, she would eliminate him. Pain. It roared through Commander Dane Carter's body as consciousness slammed back into him. His skull throbbed, his ribs ached, and something warm and sticky traced a slow path down his temple. The cockpit of his crashed dropship was a wreck of sparking wires, cracked screens, and crushed metal. "Shit!" he muttered, voice hoarse. He forced himself upright, his military instincts overriding the screaming protests of his muscles. The reinforced glass of the cockpit had shattered, revealing the lush alien jungle outside. Towering trees with violet leaves loomed over the wreckage, their bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly in the twilight. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just any planet. Zalera. The Forbidden World. His unit had whispered rumors about it, an entire civilization of female warriors, deadly and secretive, hidden deep in the outer systems. No one who had stumbled upon Zalera had ever returned. And now he was stranded here. Dane grimaced, unstrapping himself from the pilot's seat. His combat suit had absorbed most of the impact, but his left arm burned from a deep gash. He grabbed a med patch from his belt, slapping it over the wound before reaching for his sidearm. Rule number 1 of crash landings: always be armed. Something rustled in the jungle. He froze, every muscle locking into place. Then he heard it, a whisper of movement, almost too silent for human ears. He wasn't alone. Zalera crouched on a thick branch, her spear held firm in her grasp. The outsider had emerged from his ruined vessel, and she studied him with the precision of a predator. A human male. Tall. Broad-shouldered. His short, dark hair was matted with blood, his jaw tight with pain, yet his sharp green eyes swept the area with unwavering focus. Unlike the clumsy creatures the old stories had described, this one moved like a warrior, steady, controlled, prepared for attack. Her heart hammered once, an instinctual reaction she did not welcome. He was dangerous. She had watched him patch his wound, check his weapon, and scan his surroundings within moments of regaining consciousness. The efficiency of his movements intrigued her. The men of ancient records had been described as reckless and impulsive, driven by chaos and unrestrained desire. But this one? There was calculation in his eyes. Zalera exhaled softly and signaled to the 3 huntresses hidden in the foliage. Surround him. The outsider turned suddenly, his weapon raised. Too fast. Too aware. Their element of surprise was gone. Zalera didn't hesitate. She dropped from the tree, landing with feline grace before him, her spear angled in silent warning. The huntresses emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn, cutting off any escape. The human did not flinch. Instead, his lips curved, not in fear, but amusement. "Guess I've been expected," he said, his voice a low rumble. Zalera's grip on her spear tightened. He was speaking her language. 1,000 questions surged through her mind, but she forced them down. No distractions. "You will come with us," she commanded, her voice firm. "If you resist, you will be subdued." His green eyes flickered with something unreadable. Curiosity? Calculation? Then, to her astonishment, he smirked. Subdued, huh? Now that's an interesting threat. A flicker of heat curled in her stomach, unexpected and unwanted. She silenced it immediately. Move! She ordered, stepping closer, daring him to defy her. His gaze met hers, steady, unyielding. For a tense moment, the space between them hummed with something electric. Then, finally, he sighed. All right, warrior princess. Lead the way. Solara frowned at the unfamiliar term, but ignored it. He would learn soon enough. Solara was no place for defiance. With a sharp nod to her huntresses, she turned, leading him through the dense jungle toward the sanctum. She didn't glance back. But she could feel his eyes on her. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know if she had captured a prisoner, or invited a storm. Dane Carter had been in enemy custody before. He knew the drill, hands bound, weapons confiscated, every move watched with silent, lethal intent. Yet this was different. The Zalaran warriors didn't just guard him, they studied him. Their violet eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked over his every movement. They whispered in a language he barely caught, their hushed voices carrying both fascination and warning. They weren't just wary of him, they were curious. And at the center of them all was her. Lady Solara? She walked ahead of him, her dark cloak trailing behind her like the shadow of a storm. He had met commanding officers, hardened generals, and warlords in his time, but none had carried themselves like she did. Each step radiated authority, every glance a silent command. She wasn't just their leader, she was their law. And that law had no place for men. The jungle path opened into a city of shimmering towers, their structures carved from smooth, opalescent stone. Lush vines curled around archways, glowing faintly in the twilight, casting the city in an ethereal light. The air smelled of rain-kissed petals and something deeper, the scent of a world untouched by war. It would have been breathtaking. If he weren't a prisoner. The moment they stepped into the city's heart, a procession of armored warriors closed in, their expressions unreadable. Solara didn't slow, leading him toward an immense temple-like structure adorned with flowing silver inscriptions. He exhaled sharply. The trial was about to begin. Solara halted before the High Council, her posture unshaken. The vast chamber was silent, save for the steady hum of bioluminescent braziers casting ghostly light over the stone walls. The elders sat before her, their regal faces lined with age and wisdom. They did not look at her. They looked at him. The human male. Solara did not allow herself to fidget. Her heart still beat too fast from their journey, the memory of his unwavering gaze lingering in her thoughts. He should have been fearful, subdued. Instead, he stood unbowed, his arms still bound behind his back, but his presence unchained. He was the first man in a century to set foot on Zalara. And he acted like he belonged here. Lady Solara, the eldest elder intoned, her voice smooth but heavy with judgment. You have brought an outsider to our sacred halls. Speak. Solara lifted her chin. His ship fell from the sky. I captured him before he could flee. The elder's sharp gaze flicked toward Dane. And yet he does not fear you. Dane smirked. Should I? A ripple of tension spread through the chamber. The warriors lining the walls shifted, hands instinctively tightening on their weapons. Solara shot him a glare. Fool! Do you have a death wish? You are insolent, another elder remarked, unimpressed. A male should not speak so boldly in our halls. Dane raised an eyebrow. A male shouldn't be here at all, should he? Silence. Solara's jaw tightened. He's testing them. She had seen it in his eyes during their journey, the way he measured everything, every glance, every reaction. He wasn't just some lost soldier. He was assessing their weaknesses, pushing limits, learning their rules. And she hated that a part of her wanted to see how far he'd go. We should execute him, one of the elders said bluntly. Solara's fingers curled at her sides. The decision had been inevitable. The laws were clear. And yet, the image of him standing alone in the jungle, bleeding yet defiant, refused to leave her mind. "We know nothing of him yet," Solara said evenly. "He spoke our language. He knew our world. That is not coincidence." The elders exchanged glances. "Interrogation, then?" Solara inclined her head. "I will oversee it myself." The chamber was silent for a moment, then the elder nodded. "So be it." The cell was carved into the stone of the sanctum's depths, the air cool, laced with the scent of damp earth and ancient secrets. The energy field shimmered between the bars, locking Dane within. Solara stood outside, arms crossed. "So," he drawled, leaning against the wall, "should I be expecting torture, or do you just plan on staring at me all night?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You know too much about us." His smirk didn't fade. "I know stories. The galaxy whispers about Solara. No one comes back to confirm if they're true." She stepped closer. "Yet you came anyway." Dane tilted his head. "Not by choice." "You expect me to believe that?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Believe whatever you want. My mission had nothing to do with Solara." "Then why are you here?" For the first time, his expression shifted. Something flickered beneath the surface, quick as a shadow. "Classified." Solara's patience thinned. "You are not in a position to keep secrets, human." He exhaled through his nose, eyes briefly closing. Then, when they opened, he met her gaze fully. "Solara, right?" he murmured. Her name in his mouth felt like something intimate, something forbidden. Her shoulders squared. "Lady Solara to you." His lips quirked, but his gaze was serious. "Fine. Lady Solara, I don't plan on dying here, and I sure as hell don't plan on staying locked up. Whatever you and your council think, I didn't come here looking for trouble. But if you push me into a corner..." She took a step closer, the energy barrier between them humming softly. "You'll what?" she challenged. His gaze darkened. "Find a way out." For a moment they stood locked in silence, two forces, opposing yet drawn together by an unspoken current. Solara should have hated the certainty in his voice. Instead, she found herself wondering if he could actually do it. And if he did, why a part of her almost wanted him to. The sanctum's lower levels were quiet at this hour, save for the distant hum of bioluminescent braziers casting their eerie glow against the stone walls. Solara stood before the energy field that sealed Dane Carter within his cell. She had been here too long already, lingering in silence, watching him. She told herself it was duty. Yet duty had never left her so unsettled before. Dane leaned against the stone wall, his arms now freed, but his movements were still limited by the force-bound shackles wrapped around his wrists. They weren't necessary, not with the sheer number of warriors stationed above, but the council had ordered it. A reminder. He was an outsider. A threat. But as he stood there, studying her in return, Solara couldn't ignore the strange contradiction he represented. His presence was dangerous. Yet he wasn't afraid. "You're still here," he noted, his voice smooth, edged with something unreadable. Solara forced a neutral expression. "You have yet to answer my questions." "Ah." His smirk was slow, deliberate. "So you waited for me to get comfortable before you tried again?" She narrowed her eyes. "You assume I care about your comfort, human." Dane chuckled, the sound low. "Fair enough." He stretched, rolling his shoulders. "But tell me something, Lady Solara, why am I really still alive?" She bristled at the question, though she had expected it. The council had been clear. He should be executed. His knowledge of Solara was unnatural, too precise to be chance. No outsider had been this deep into their world in over a century. And yet she had stayed their hand. "You're valuable," she said evenly. He gave a slow nod. "That sounds like a half-truth." Solara hated how perceptive he was. "Tell me," he continued, stepping closer to the shimmering barrier, "is it because you're curious?" "Curious?" she echoed. "About me." Solara's pulse quickened. His voice was softer now, lacking the teasing edge he so often used. He wasn't just provoking her, he was watching her. I have no interest in you, she said coolly. He tilted his head, gaze searching. Liar! The word was quiet, but it struck like an arrow. Solara clenched her jaw. You overestimate yourself, human. Dane's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of something in his eyes, too quick to decipher. But instead of pushing further, he exhaled and leaned back against the wall. All right, he said, voice lighter. Let's say I am valuable. What now? Are you planning to keep me locked up forever? Her fingers tightened around the folds of her cloak. No. She had already begun making her case to the council, pushing for an alternative to his execution. But convincing them to spare him was one thing, figuring out what to do with him was another. You will stay here until we decide your fate, she said. Dane hummed. Not a bad answer, but I was hoping for something a little more personal. She scoffed. Personal? You've been standing there longer than necessary. I'm starting to think you just enjoy our little conversations. Solara's patience thinned. She took a slow, deliberate step closer, letting the energy barrier crackle softly between them. You seem convinced of your own importance, human, she said, her voice calm but edged. Tell me, is that arrogance or desperation? His lips quirked at the challenge, but his eyes, they sharpened. Neither, he murmured. It's observation. Solara held his gaze, refusing to waver. But something about the way he looked at her, like he was seeing beyond the mask she always wore, unnerved her in a way she hadn't expected. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the charged silence. She turned swiftly as Commander Velka, her second in command, entered the corridor. My lady, Velka said, her voice clipped. The council requests your presence. Urgently. Solara nodded, pushing aside whatever unspoken tension had settled between her and Dane. I will return, she said simply, before turning on her heel and following Velka up the stone corridor. The council chamber was colder than usual. Solara stood at attention as the elders regarded her with solemn expressions. We have made a decision regarding the human, the eldest elder announced. Solara's shoulders stiffened. And? There was a pause before the answer came. He is to remain under your direct custody, the elder declared. You will extract all information he holds and determine if he is a true threat. Solara's fingers curled at her sides. You mean spy on him? You have already spared his life, another elder stated. Prove that it was not a mistake. Solara swallowed down the irritation rising in her throat. The decision was both a test and a punishment. She had argued for his survival, and now the weight of that choice rested entirely on her. You will ensure he does not escape, the elder continued. And you will uncover the truth of his arrival here. Solara took a steady breath. Then, finally, she bowed her head. As you command? Dane was waiting for her when she returned. She wasn't sure how, but he had felt the shift before she even spoke a word. Well? He asked. Solara stepped to the edge of the barrier, letting the glow of the energy field illuminate her features. The council has made their decision, she said. You are to remain under my custody. Dane raised an eyebrow. Custody? You will not be executed, she clarified. But you belong to me now. His expression flickered, something unreadable behind his gaze. Then, to her mild irritation, he smirked. Belong to you, huh? He exhaled, shaking his head. Could be worse. Solara scowled. This is not a jest. He gave a slow nod. I know. His voice had lost its usual amusement. But tell me something, Lady Solara. What happens if you decide you don't like the answers I give? She hesitated. Because for the first time since capturing him, she realized she didn't have an answer. And that was dangerous. She turned away. We will see, she murmured. And as she walked away, leaving him behind the barrier, she could feel his eyes on her, steady, searching. As if he knew this was only the beginning. Solara had spent years mastering control over her voice, her stance, the very rhythm of her breath. She had been raised to be the embodiment of discipline, the unwavering blade of Zalara's will. Yet, as she strode through the stone corridors toward Dane's cell, she felt something she had not allowed herself in a long time. Uncertainty. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The Council's decree was clear. She was to extract the truth from the human, learn how he had infiltrated Zalara, and determine if he posed a threat. But beneath that official order lurked something unspoken. They expected her to break him. And yet, in the dim glow of his confinement, it wasn't Dane who seemed close to breaking. It was her. She arrived at his cell to find him sitting on the edge of the narrow sleeping platform, elbows resting on his knees. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he remarked. Zalara arched a brow. "You're in no position to dictate my schedule." His lips quirked. "I wasn't complaining. Just noticing." She deactivated the energy field with a flick of her wrist, stepping inside. The air between them shifted instantly. No longer divided by a glowing barrier, the space felt too intimate, too charged. Dane didn't move, but his gaze followed her, keen and assessing. "So," he said after a moment, "are we finally having an honest conversation?" Zalara remained standing, hands folded behind her back. "That depends. Are you ready to tell me why you're really here?" He exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "I already told you. My ship malfunctioned. I wasn't trying to land on Zalara." A convenient answer. A true one. She studied him. He was frustratingly difficult to read, too controlled for an outsider, too measured in his responses. She had interrogated warriors, mercenaries, even spies, and yet this human held his ground like someone who had nothing to fear. Or worse, someone who knew she wouldn't hurt him. Zalara shifted her stance, stepping closer. "You expect me to believe that a human, alone, somehow drifted past our planetary defenses and landed in restricted territory?" Dane held her gaze. "I expect you to consider that not everything is a conspiracy. Zalara does not believe in coincidences." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that makes two of us." Zalara frowned at his tone. There was something beneath it, something he wasn't saying. "You speak as if you've been here before," she pressed. Dane hesitated. It was slight, just the briefest pause, but it was enough. Zalara seized it. "You have." His jaw tensed. "Not in the way you think." "Then explain." For a long moment, he was silent. Then, finally, he exhaled. "I knew someone from Zalara once." Zalara stiffened. Impossible. No human had set foot on this world in over a century. Any outsider who had learned of Zalara's existence was either dead or erased from memory. "Who?" she demanded. Dane's gaze flickered, as if weighing something. Then, to her frustration, he shook his head. "It doesn't matter." Zalara hated being denied answers. In a single motion, she closed the last of the space between them, gripping the fabric of his shirt and pulling him toward her. His breath hitched, but he didn't resist. "You don't get to decide what matters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dane's pulse beat steadily beneath her fingertips, his body warm against hers. He didn't struggle, didn't pull away. Instead, his lips parted slightly, his breath ghosting against her cheek. "Zalara." The way he said her name, low, steady, sent a shiver down her spine. She should have let go. She didn't. Instead, her grip tightened. This was dangerous. The line between captor and captive blurred too easily in the dim light of this room, in the quiet where duty and desire wove together like strands of silk. Dane's hands remained at his sides, yet his presence pressed against her, the heat between them undeniable. "You're trembling," he murmured. Zalara sucked in a sharp breath. She wasn't. But the accusation left her off balance. She pushed him away abruptly, her heart hammering. "This changes nothing," she snapped. Dane exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You keep saying that, but I'm starting to think you're trying to convince yourself." Zalara turned on her heel. She needed distance, needed clarity. I will return when you're ready to be honest, she said, moving toward the door. But before she could activate the energy field, his voice stopped her. You're asking the wrong questions. She hesitated. What? Dane stood now, watching her intently. You want to know why I'm here. But maybe you should be asking who sent me. A cold weight settled in her stomach. She turned slowly. What do you mean? Dane's expression was unreadable again, but there was something different now, something heavy. I wasn't alone, he said quietly. And if I don't get back soon, they'll come looking. The air in the room shifted. Solara's grip tightened around the device in her hand. Who? She asked, voice razor sharp. Dane exhaled. The people who don't want peace between humans and Zalera. Solara's pulse roared in her ears. She had assumed Dane was a spy, or at worst, a rogue wanderer. But if what he was saying was true, if others were coming, then his presence here wasn't just an anomaly. It was a warning. She stared at him, her mind racing through possibilities, strategies, threats. Then, quietly, she spoke. If you lied to me about any of this, I'll kill you myself. Dane smiled. Not a smirk this time, not teasing, not mocking. Just soft. I know, he murmured. Solara swallowed. She activated the energy field and walked away, but even as she left him behind, her heart refused to settle. Because for the first time since this began, she wasn't sure if she wanted him to be lying, or if the truth was far, far worse.